The courtroom was eerily silent as Judge Helen Carpenter scanned the file before her, her sharp, no-nonsense gaze flicking to the small, trembling figure standing at the defendant's table. Elijah, a boy no older than 10, stood dwarfed by the towering adults around him, his thin frame hidden under oversized clothes. His hands fidgeted nervously, his eyes avoiding hers. "Why were you at the diner after hours?" Judge Carpenter asked, her voice steady but firm. The boy hesitated, then finally whispered, his voice cracking, "I was looking for food. I was hungry." The courtroom held its collective breath. For the first time in her career, Helen Carpenter felt her composure waver. This wasn't just another case. It was the beginning of something that would unravel the brokenness of a system she had spent her life upholding. It was the start of a journey neither Helen nor Elijah could have foreseen. A journey of compassion, resilience, and the fight for a second chance. The small-town streets were unusually quiet as Officer Mike Bennett drove his patrol car through downtown. The crisp night air bit at his cheeks as he rolled down the window, his routine disrupted by an unusual sight. A lone figure pressed against the glass of Martha's diner. The diner had been closed for hours, its neon sign flickering dimly in the darkness. Mike pulled over, his police training kicking in, as he observed the figure more closely. It was a boy, no older than 10, dressed in clothes far too large for his thin frame. His sneakers had holes at the toes, and his hollow cheeks told a story of hunger and neglect. "Hey there, buddy," Mike called out, stepping out of his car. His tone was calm, but his presence startled the boy. Elijah, as he would later learn his name, took a step back, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "It's okay," Mike said, crouching to the boy's level. "I'm not here to hurt you. Are you hungry?" The boy hesitated, but didn't answer. His stomach, however, spoke for him with a loud growl. Mike's heart sank. "How about this? Let's head to the station. We've got some snacks there, and you can warm up." After a long pause, Elijah nodded. It was a small gesture, but Mike knew it meant everything. At the station, Elijah devoured the sandwich and chips Mike had scrounged from the vending machine. Watching him eat, Mike couldn't help but notice the boy's guarded posture, his wary glances. When he ran Elijah's name through the system, nothing came up. No missing persons report, no recent alerts. It was as though Elijah had appeared out of nowhere. The night wore on, and Elijah eventually fell asleep on the break room couch, wrapped in a scratchy blanket from the supply closet. Mike stayed late, unable to shake the image of the boy standing alone outside the diner. Something about him, his quiet desperation, stirred something in Mike that he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Elijah was brought before Judge Helen Carpenter, a woman known for her strict demeanor and unwavering commitment to the law. Helen had presided over countless juvenile cases, but something about Elijah struck a chord in her. His oversized clothes and haunted eyes were a stark contrast to the hardened teenagers she was used to seeing. "Can you tell me why you were out so late?" Helen asked, her voice measured but not unkind. Elijah shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was looking for food. I'm starving." The raw honesty in his words cut through the courtroom like a knife. For a moment, Helen forgot where she was. Her pen hovered above the paper, unmoving. That night, as she sat alone in her chambers, Elijah's words echoed in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of his frail figure, the way he had clutched the hem of his oversized shirt. It wasn't just hunger that plagued him. It was something deeper, something systemic. And for the first time in her career, Helen Carpenter found herself questioning whether the law was enough. The sun crept over the horizon as Officer Mike Bennett steered his patrol car toward the courthouse. Elijah sat silently in the passenger seat, clutching a crumpled paper bag containing the remains of last night's meal. His oversized shirt hung off his small frame, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. Yet they seemed to see nothing at all. Mike had tried to make conversation during the short drive, but Elijah had offered little more than nods or one-word answers. When they arrived, the courthouse loomed like a fortress of order in a world that had failed the boy. Mike gently guided Elijah inside, handing him over to a clerk, who led him to a holding room. Mike lingered, his instincts screaming that leaving this boy alone was the wrong thing to do. But protocol was protocol. In Judge Helen Carpenter's chambers, the day began as usual. Stacks of case files, back-to-back hearings, and a strong cup of black coffee to fuel her meticulous focus. Yet the case sitting at the top of her pile was anything but usual. She read through the brief notes. A young boy found wandering alone. No identification, no family. Her lips pursed as she skimmed the sparse details. At 9 a.m., Elijah stood before her. His small figure seemed to shrink even more under the courtroom lights, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. Helen, who had presided over countless juvenile cases, felt her professional detachment waver. "State your name for the record," she began, her tone sharp but steady. "Elijah," he whispered, barely audible. Helen adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "And your last name?" Elijah hesitated. "Brooks," he finally said, his voice cracking. The clerk jotted it down, but Helen noticed the boy's hesitation. She pressed on. "Elijah, can you tell me where your parents are?" At that, Elijah's face fell. His thin shoulders slumped, and he stared at the polished courtroom floor as if it might swallow him up. "I don't have any," he mumbled. Helen's pen froze mid-stroke. She was used to evasive answers, but this felt different. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. "What were you doing at Martha's diner?" Helen asked, her voice softening slightly. I was looking for food," Elijah admitted. "I'm hungry." For the second time in as many days, Helen felt her composure crack. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the boy's admission hanging in the air. She glanced at Officer Bennett, who stood in the corner, his face a mask of quiet concern. Later, back in her chambers, Helen couldn't shake Elijah's image from her mind. She spread the boy's sparse case file across her desk. It was practically empty. No birth certificate, no recent address, no school records. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Helen picked up her phone and dialed Child Protective Services. After a few rings, a frazzled caseworker named Nancy answered. "I need everything you have on an Elijah Brooks," Helen said briskly. After a long pause, Nancy sighed. "Judge Carpenter, we don't have much. His file is incomplete." Helen pinched the bridge of her nose. "How does that happen? Overloaded caseloads, budget cuts, staff turnover?" Nancy replied wearily. "It's not an excuse, but it's the reality." "Not good enough," Helen snapped, her frustration boiling over. "This is a 10-year-old child we're talking about." "I'll do what I can," Nancy promised, but her tone didn't inspire confidence. That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, a glass of wine untouched beside her. Her own daughter, Sarah, had once been this age. Memories of ballet recitals and school science fairs flooded back, along with the bitter sting of regret. She had missed so much of Sarah's childhood, consumed by her career. And now Sarah, a social worker herself, had distanced herself from Helen. Their relationship strained to the point of breaking. Helen glanced at her phone, Sarah's contact information glaring up at her. Her finger hovered over the call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Instead, she turned her attention back to Elijah's file, determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, Helen called a meeting with Officer Bennett. They sat in her chambers, the tension palpable. "What's your take on him?" Helen asked. Mike rubbed the back of his neck. "He's scared, hungry. But there's more to it. He doesn't trust easily, and who can blame him? It's like he's been on his own for a long time." Helen nodded, her thoughts churning. No missing persons reports. No family coming forward. It doesn't add up. Mike hesitated before speaking again. "Judge, I've been on the force for 15 years. I've seen my share of runaways, neglected kids. But this one, there's something different about him." Helen looked at the officer, her resolve hardening. "Then, we'll get to the bottom of it." By the afternoon, Helen had pieced together fragments of Elijah's story. His mother, Angela Brooks, had died 2 years earlier, after a long battle with cancer. The foster care system had taken him in, but the records were riddled with gaps and inconsistencies. His last known foster family had simply stopped filing reports 6 months ago, and no one had followed up. Helen sat back in her chair, her heart heavy. The system had failed Elijah in every possible way, and now he was paying the price. That night, as Elijah settled into a temporary shelter, Helen drove home in silence. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the pieces of Elijah's fractured life falling into place. She couldn't ignore the parallels to her own failures as a parent. For the first time in years, Helen felt something stir within her. A deep, unshakable need to do more. Elijah wasn't just another case. He was a reminder that even the strongest systems could fail the most vulnerable. And it was up to people like her to make it right. The clock in Judge Helen Carpenter's chambers ticked steadily, each second echoing in the quiet room, as she sat surrounded by the remnants of Elijah Brooks' case file. The thin manila folder on her desk seemed to mock her, its sparse content a glaring indictment of the system she had spent decades serving. For the first time in her career, Helen felt not just frustration, but shame. She flipped through the pages again, hastily filled forms, incomplete visitation logs, and a glaring 6-month gap where no one had checked on Elijah. The name Angela Brooks appeared in the earliest documents, a death certificate confirming his mother's passing from cancer. That was 2 years ago. Since then, Elijah had been shuffled between foster homes like a piece of misplaced luggage. The notes on his placements were sparse, but troubling. One family cited for neglect, another for emotional abuse. The last record, dated 6 months prior, indicated that Elijah had run away. After that, nothing. Helen pressed her fingertips to her temples, trying to stave off a headache. How could this happen? How could a child simply disappear from the system without anyone noticing? That evening, Helen sat in her car, outside the shelter where Elijah was staying. The modest brick building stood at the end of a quiet street, its exterior faded but clean. She had called ahead to arrange a meeting with the staff, determined to see for herself how Elijah was doing. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the mismatched furniture and faded posters that decorated the common room. A tired-looking woman introduced herself as Maria, the shelter's director. She led Helen down a narrow hallway lined with children's artworks taped to the walls. "We're doing what we can for him," Maria said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But he's reserved, quiet, doesn't talk much, except when he's drawing." Helen stopped outside a small room, where Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor. He was hunched over a piece of paper, his pencil moving in steady, deliberate strokes. She watched him for a moment, noting the intense focus on his face. On the paper, a figure was taking shape, a woman in a rocking chair, holding a child close to her chest. "Hello, Elijah," Helen said softly, stepping into the room. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his drawing. "Hi," he murmured. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, keeping her distance so as not to overwhelm him. "That's a beautiful drawing. Who is it?" "My mom," he said, his voice barely audible. Helen's heart clenched. She had read about Angela Brooks in the file, a single mother who had fought hard to give Elijah a stable life despite her illness. The love and warmth in Elijah's drawing made her throat tighten. "Do you like it here?" Helen asked, trying to gauge his comfort. Elijah shrugged, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. "It's okay. Better than some places." Later that night, Helen returned home, her thoughts consumed by Elijah's situation. She couldn't shake the image of his haunted eyes or the tenderness in his drawing. Sitting at her kitchen table, she opened a bottle of wine and stared at her phone. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed her daughter Sarah. The phone rang twice before Sarah picked up. "Hello?" Her tone was guarded, almost formal. "Sarah, it's Mom," Helen said, her voice betraying her nerves. "I know," Sarah replied curtly. "Caller ID." Helen took a deep breath. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. "With what?" "There's a boy. His name is Elijah Brooks. He's 10 years old, and the system has completely failed him. I think he's slipped through the cracks in ways I can't even comprehend." Sarah's sigh was audible. "And you're calling me because I'm a social worker, not because I'm your daughter." "That's not fair," Helen said quietly. "This isn't about us. It's about him." "And what do you want me to do, Mom? Wave a magic wand? You know as well as I do that the system is broken. You've seen it in your courtroom 1,000 times." "Yes," Helen admitted, her voice rising slightly. "But this time, I'm not just watching from the bench. I want to fix it. I want to help him." Sarah was silent for a long moment. "Meet me tomorrow at Carlton's Cafe. Noon." The next day, Helen arrived at the cafe early, choosing a booth in the back corner, where they could talk privately. She ordered coffee but barely touched it, her nerves making her stomach churn. When Sarah walked in, her professional demeanor was firmly in place. She slid into the booth across from Helen, her expression neutral. "Tell me about the case," Sarah said, skipping pleasantries. Helen laid out the details, her frustration evident. "There's nothing in his file, Sarah. It's a mess. He's been abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect him." Sarah listened intently, her arms crossed. "That's not uncommon," she said finally. "The foster care system is overwhelmed. Caseworkers are handling double, sometimes triple, their recommended caseloads. And when budget cuts happen, kids like Elijah are the ones who pay the price." "What can we do?" Helen asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Sarah leaned back in her seat, her expression softening slightly. "There's a transitional care center called New Horizons. They're understaffed and underfunded, but they're one of the best options for kids like Elijah." By the end of the week, Elijah had been placed at New Horizons. The facility was a step up from the shelter, a cheerful building painted in warm colors, with a small garden out front. Helen and Sarah visited together, their strained relationship beginning to thaw under the shared purpose of helping Elijah. Inside, they found Elijah in the common room, sitting at a table with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. Helen approached cautiously. "Hi, Elijah," she said, sitting down across from him. "How are you settling in?" He shrugged. "It's okay." Helen placed a small sketchbook and a set of colored pencils on the table. "I thought you might like these." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, Helen saw a flicker of something resembling hope. He picked up a pencil and began sketching immediately, his movements more relaxed than she'd seen before. As they left the facility, Helen turned to Sarah. "Thank you for helping me with this." Sarah nodded. "Don't thank me yet, Mom. The hard part is just beginning." The morning sun filtered through the large windows of New Horizons, casting warm patches of light on the linoleum floor. Helen Carpenter sat on a wooden bench in the lobby, her eyes fixed on the mural that adorned the wall. It was a cheerful scene of children playing in a field, the bright colors starkly contrasting the heavy burden she felt. Elijah had been here for a week, and she couldn't stop thinking about how tentative his situation still was. Maria, the center's director, appeared from around the corner, her arms filled with folders. "Judge Carpenter, thanks for coming," she said with a warm but tired smile. "Elijah's been adjusting, well, as much as can be expected. He spends most of his time drawing." Helen nodded, following Maria down the hallway. They passed several rooms, where children were engaged in various activities, some playing board games, others reading. In one room, a counselor was leading a group session. But it was the art room that caught Helen's attention. Inside, Elijah sat alone at a table near the window, hunched over his sketch pad. His pencil moved with careful precision, creating a detailed landscape of rolling hills and a single tree bending in the wind. The intensity of his focus made Helen hesitate to interrupt, but Maria encouraged her forward. "Elijah," Maria said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Judge Carpenter is here to see you." Elijah looked up briefly, his expression guarded. "Hi," he murmured, his gaze flicking back to his drawing. "That's beautiful," Helen said, sitting down across from him. "You have a real talent." Elijah shrugged, but there was a faint blush on his cheeks. Helen noticed a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he added more detail to the tree. Later that day, Helen found herself standing outside her daughter Sarah's office. The frosted glass door bore her name, Sarah Carpenter, social worker. Helen hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Their last meeting had been tense, but she knew she needed Sarah's insight to navigate the next steps for Elijah. When she finally entered, Sarah looked up from her cluttered desk, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Mom, I wasn't expecting you." Helen sat down in the chair across from her. "I need your help. Again." Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. "With Elijah?" Helen nodded. "He's at New Horizons now, but that's just a temporary solution. I want to do more for him. I need to understand what's really going on in the system. What's failing these kids?" Sarah studied her mother for a moment, before sighing. "It's not just one thing. The system is underfunded, overburdened, and riddled with inefficiencies. Caseworkers like me are drowning in caseloads, and kids like Elijah, they fall through the cracks because there aren't enough resources to catch them. I want to fix that," Helen said, her voice resolute. "But I also want to fix us." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Us?" "I wasn't there for you when you needed me most," Helen admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I see that now. And the helping Elijah, it's making me realize how much I missed with you." The room fell silent, the weight of Helen's words hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice softer. "If you're serious about helping Elijah, I'll support you. But this is going to take more than just good intentions." As days turned into weeks, Elijah began to show subtle signs of opening up. He attended art therapy sessions regularly, and his drawings became more vivid, more personal. One afternoon, Helen visited the center again and found Elijah drawing a woman, sitting in a rocking chair with a child in her lap. The detail was extraordinary, the tenderness in the scene almost palpable. "Is that your mom?" Helen asked gently. Elijah nodded but didn't look up. She used to sing to me, he said quietly. Even when she was sick. Helen's chest tightened. She sounds like she was a wonderful mother. Elijah glanced at her, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She was. Meanwhile, Sarah began working behind the scenes, connecting Helen with resources and advocates who could help navigate the bureaucracy. She introduced Helen to New Horizons board members and facilitated meetings with local officials to discuss funding for transitional care programs. During one such meeting, Helen met Diana Martinez, a prominent local artist who volunteered at the center. Diana was immediately captivated by Elijah's talent and suggested showcasing his work at a community art exhibit. I think it could be a turning point for him, Diana said. Art has a way of giving kids like Elijah a voice when words fail. Helen agreed, though she knew it would be a challenge to convince Elijah to share his work. He was still painfully shy and hesitant to trust anyone outside his small circle. One evening, as Helen prepared dinner at home, Sarah stopped by unannounced. She carried a folder filled with case studies and data on foster care reform. I've been thinking, Sarah said, as they sat at the dining table. Elijah's case isn't unique, but it's personal now. If we want to make a real difference, we need to use his story to shine a light on the system's failures. Helen nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. What if we started an initiative to address the gaps? Training for caseworkers, better oversight for foster placements, something tangible? Sarah smiled faintly. That's ambitious, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you. At New Horizons, Elijah continued to blossom under the guidance of Maria and the other staff. He formed tentative friendships with some of the other children, though he still spent most of his time drawing. One day, Helen arrived to find him sketching a house nestled in the woods, smoke curling from the chimney, and flowers blooming in the yard. Is this your dream home? Helen asked. Elijah nodded. It's where I'd want to live, if I could. Helen's heart ached at the simplicity of his wish. We'll find a place like this for you, she promised. Somewhere you can feel safe and loved. Elijah didn't respond, but the small smile that tugged at his lips told her he wanted to believe her. As the chapter drew to a close, Helen and Sarah stood together outside New Horizons, watching Elijah play with a group of kids in the garden. For the first time in years, Helen felt a sense of hope, not just for Elijah, but for her own relationship with her daughter. We're making progress, Helen said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Sarah nodded. But there's still a long way to go. Helen smiled, her gaze fixed on Elijah, as he laughed for the first time since she'd met him. One step at a time. The courthouse hallway echoed with the sound of Helen Carpenter's steady heels as she approached her chambers. Despite her composed exterior, her mind raced with the implications of her next move. Filing for emergency guardianship of Elijah was not a decision she had taken lightly. It was a direct challenge to the ethical boundaries of her position as a judge. But it felt like the only way forward. Elijah needed stability, and she was determined to provide it, even if it meant risking her career. Helen sat at her desk, staring at the guardianship forms spread before her. The legal jargon felt more daunting than ever. She had spent years on the bench, upholding the very system she now sought to challenge. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, straightening the papers. Sarah entered, a file folder tucked under her arm. "I brought the documents you asked for," she said, setting them down. Her voice carried a note of concern. "Mom, are you sure about this? Filing for guardianship could open you up to a lot of scrutiny." Helen looked up, meeting her daughter's gaze. "I know," she admitted. "But what kind of judge would I be if I let fear stop me from doing the right thing. Elijah has been let down at every turn. I can't be another person who fails him." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Then let's do this right. You'll need all the support you can get." Helen's first stop was a meeting with Greg Matthews, the head of Child Protective Services. His office was as cluttered as his caseload, with stacks of files threatening to topple over at any moment. "Judge Carpenter," he greeted her with a tired smile, gesturing to a chair. "What brings you here today?" Helen wasted no time. "I'm filing for emergency guardianship of Elijah Brooks." Greg blinked, clearly taken aback. "That's highly irregular. You know the scrutiny this will bring, not just on you, but on the entire system." Helen's jaw tightened. What's more irregular is a child falling through the cracks, as Elijah has. He's been living in survival mode for too long. He needs a stable home. Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "I admire your commitment, but the process is slow for a reason. Background checks, home studies, matching profiles. It's all designed to protect the child. And yet, despite all that process, he ended up on the streets," Helen countered, her voice firm. "Tell me, Greg, how many other Elijahs are out there right now, waiting for the system to save them?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Greg finally nodded. "I'll expedite the paperwork. But this won't be easy." At New Horizons, Elijah sat on the edge of his bed, clutching his sketch pad. He had overheard snippets of conversations between staff members, words like guardianship and court hearing, that made his stomach churn. He was used to being passed from one place to another, each move eroding his trust a little more. When Helen arrived that afternoon, he barely looked up. She sat beside him, her presence calm and reassuring. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," she began. "I'm filing to become your guardian." Elijah's eyes widened, and he turned to her with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you want me?" Helen's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his question. "Because I see how strong you are, Elijah," she said gently, "and I believe in you. You deserve to have someone in your corner, someone who won't give up on you." Elijah's gaze dropped to his lap. "What if you change your mind? Everyone always does." "I won't," Helen promised, her voice firm. "You're not just another case to me. You're family." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, home visits, and late nights. Helen juggled her responsibilities as a judge with her new role as Elijah's advocate, often finding herself stretched thin. But the moments she spent with Elijah made it all worth it. One evening, as they sat together in the common room at New Horizons, Elijah showed her a new drawing. It depicted a small boy standing at the base of a towering mountain, the path to the top steep and treacherous. "This is how it feels," he said quietly, tracing the lines with his finger. Helen studied the drawing, her chest tightening. "Climbing that mountain takes courage," she said. "But you don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Elijah smiled, a small, tentative gesture that gave Helen hope. Despite their complicated history, Sarah became an invaluable ally. She arranged meetings with local nonprofits, helped gather letters of support, and even spoke at a community event about the importance of systemic reform. At one such event, Sarah stood at the podium, her voice steady and passionate. "Elijah's story is not unique," she told the crowd. "It's a reflection of a broken system that needs fixing, but it's also a story of resilience and of what can happen when people step up to make a difference." Helen watched from the audience, pride swelling in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like they were truly on the same team. Not everyone supported Helen's decision. A formal complaint was filed with the Judicial Ethics Committee, accusing her of overstepping her professional boundaries. The investigation cast a shadow over her guardianship case, threatening to derail everything she had worked for. During a tense meeting with her lawyer, Helen refused to back down. "I knew this would be a fight," she said, "and I'm ready for it." Elijah, meanwhile, sensed the tension and retreated into himself. One afternoon, Helen found him sitting alone in the art room, his sketchpad untouched. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I heard them talking," he admitted, "about how this might not work out." Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes things don't go as planned," she said honestly. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying. No matter what happens, I'm here for you." The breakthrough came unexpectedly during one of Elijah's art therapy sessions. He created a series of drawings depicting his journey, from the loss of his mother to his time in foster care, and finally, to meeting Helen. The final piece showed a small figure standing at the edge of a storm, the clouds parting to reveal a ray of light. When Helen saw the drawings, she felt tears welling up. "These are incredible, Elijah," she said. "They show so much strength." Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Do you really think I can have a home again?" he asked. Helen smiled, her voice steady. "I don't just think it, I know it." As the chapter came to a close, Helen received a call from Greg. "The guardianship hearing is set," he told her. "You'll need to be prepared for pushback, but you have a strong case." Helen hung up, her resolve stronger than ever. She looked at Elijah, who was busy sketching at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration. Despite the challenges ahead, she knew they were on the right path. "We're going to climb that mountain," she thought. "Together." The first rays of dawn filtered through the tall windows of the New Horizons Center as Elijah sat quietly at the art room's corner table. His pencil moved in slow, deliberate strokes, adding layers of detail to a sketch of a lone figure walking through dense woods. The figure's expression conveyed a mixture of fear and determination, a reflection of the artist's inner world. Helen watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy with both pride and concern. Elijah had grown more comfortable at the center, but the looming guardianship hearing and the shadows of his past weighed heavily on him. That afternoon, Helen met with Mr. Lopez, Elijah's art teacher, who had been effusive in his praise for the boy's talent during a recent parent-teacher conference. They stood in the school's art room, surrounded by vivid paintings and carefully sketched landscapes. "Elijah has a gift," Mr. Lopez said, holding up one of the boy's recent pieces. "His work isn't just technically skilled, it's emotionally profound. I've never seen anything like it from someone his age." Helen smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "He's been through so much," she said. "Art seems to be his way of processing it all." Mr. Lopez nodded. "There's a citywide youth art competition coming up next month. I think Elijah should enter. It could be a great confidence boost for him." Helen hesitated. She knew Elijah's confidence was fragile, and putting him in the spotlight could backfire. "I'll talk to him about it," she said finally. "But I won't push him." When Helen brought up the competition that evening, Elijah's initial reaction was one of quiet resistance. "What if I'm not good enough?" he asked, his voice barely audible, as he sat at the kitchen table, clutching his sketchpad. Helen crouched beside him, meeting his eyes. "Your art is incredible, Elijah. But this isn't just about winning. It's about sharing your story and showing the world the strength and resilience you have inside." Elijah stared at his sketchpad for a long moment before nodding. "I'll think about it," he said softly. The next week, during lunch at school, Elijah overheard two older boys making snide comments about foster kids. "They never amount to anything," one of them said. "Why even try?" The words hit Elijah like a physical blow, reopening old wounds of rejection and inadequacy. He withdrew into himself, skipping art club that afternoon and avoiding Helen's questions when she picked him up from school. That evening, Helen found him in his room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His sketch pad lay untouched beside him, and his usually bright eyes were clouded with hurt. "Elijah," she said gently, sitting down beside him. "What happened?" He hesitated, then mumbled, "They're right. Foster kids like me, we don't get anywhere." Helen felt a surge of anger, not at Elijah, but at the world that had made him believe such lies. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's not true," she said firmly. "You're so much more than the labels people try to put on you. You've already overcome so much, Elijah. Don't let their words define you." The following weekend, Helen took Elijah to the park, where she had first found him. They sat together on a weathered bench, under the sprawling branches of a towering oak tree. "This is where everything started," Helen said, looking out at the empty playground. "That night, I saw a boy who was scared but strong. You're still that boy, Elijah, and you're capable of so much more than you realize." Elijah glanced at her, his expression uncertain. "What if I fail?" he whispered. "Failure isn't the end," Helen replied. "It's just a step on the journey. What matters is that you keep going." Elijah was quiet for a long time, then nodded. "I'll do the competition," he said finally, his voice steady. "But only if you promise to come." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Over the next few weeks, Elijah poured his emotions into his competition piece. He spent hours sketching, erasing, and resketching, determined to create something that truly represented his journey. Helen watched in awe as the painting took shape, a small figure walking through a storm, the path ahead lit by a single beam of light, breaking through the clouds. "This is incredible," Helen said one evening, as she stood behind him, admiring his progress. "It's like you've captured hope itself." Elijah looked up at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's called My Journey," he said, "because that's what it feels like, walking through a storm, but still finding the light." The day of the competition dawned bright and clear. Helen and Sarah accompanied Elijah to the community center, where dozens of young artists were setting up their pieces. Elijah's nerves were palpable as he carefully placed his painting on an easel near a sunny window. "You've got this," Helen whispered, squeezing his shoulder. As the judges made their rounds, Helen and Sarah watched from a distance, their hearts swelling with pride as they saw people stop to admire Elijah's work. The whispers of awe and admiration confirmed what they already knew. His talent was extraordinary. When the awards were announced, Elijah didn't win first place, but he received a special recognition award for outstanding creativity and resilience. As he walked to the stage to accept his plaque, the audience erupted into applause. For the first time, Helen saw him stand tall, his shoulders back, and his eyes bright with pride. Later, a gallery owner named Diana Martinez approached them, her eyes alight with excitement. "Elijah, your work is extraordinary," she said. "I'd love to feature it in an upcoming youth exhibit at my gallery." Elijah's eyes widened, and he looked to Helen for reassurance. She nodded, her smile encouraging. "I think that's a wonderful idea." The competition marked a turning point for Elijah. In the weeks that followed, he began to open up more, both at school and at home. He joined the art club and started helping younger students with their projects, earning the admiration of his peers and teachers alike. Helen, meanwhile, found herself more determined than ever to fight for Elijah's guardianship. The hearing was just weeks away, and she knew the stakes were higher than ever. One evening, as Helen was reviewing case files at the dining room table, Elijah approached her with a new drawing. It depicted a family sitting together in a cozy living room, their faces glowing with warmth and happiness. "This is us," he said simply, handing her the sketch. Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she studied the drawing. "It's beautiful, Elijah," she said, "just like the family we're building together." As she placed the drawing on the fridge, Helen realized that, for the first time in years, her house truly felt like a home. The first light of dawn poured through the windows as Elijah carefully packed his painting into a protective case, his hands trembling slightly. The scene he had spent weeks perfecting, titled My Journey, was a powerful visual of a small figure navigating a stormy path toward a radiant beam of light. It wasn't just a painting, it was his story. Helen drove Elijah to the city's bustling community center, where the art competition was being held. The usually quiet boy seemed even more withdrawn as they parked in the crowded lot. Helen glanced at him in the rearview mirror, noting the way his small hands clutched the strap of his backpack. "You've worked so hard on this," she said gently. "Just remember, no matter what happens today, I'm proud of you." Elijah nodded but didn't respond. The weight of the day seemed to press heavily on his small shoulders. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of easels displayed vibrant paintings, detailed sketches, and intricate sculptures. Families bustled about, adjusting frames and chatting excitedly. Elijah looked around, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. "This way," Helen said, guiding him to his designated spot near a large window. Together they set up the painting, carefully adjusting the lighting to emphasize its intricate details. Sarah arrived moments later, carrying a thermos of hot chocolate and a bag of granola bars. "Elijah," she said warmly, "this painting is going to blow everyone away." The boy offered a small, nervous smile. "I hope so." As the competition began, Elijah stayed close to Helen and Sarah, his gaze darting nervously toward the growing crowd. Families and judges wandered the room, pausing at various exhibits. When a group stopped in front of Elijah's painting, murmuring in admiration, he unconsciously stepped back, half hiding behind Helen. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready," she reassured him. The judges lingered longer than expected, jotting notes and exchanging whispers. Helen felt a swell of pride, but kept her hand on Elijah's shoulder, grounding him. Hours later, the award ceremony began. Elijah fidgeted in his chair, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the armrest. One by one, winners were announced, their names greeted with applause. "And now for a special recognition award," the announcer said, her voice warm and inviting. "For outstanding creativity and resilience, we honor Elijah Brooks for his piece, My Journey." Helen and Sarah were on their feet, clapping loudly as Elijah's name echoed through the room. The boy froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Go on," Sarah whispered, nudging him gently. Elijah stood hesitantly, walking to the stage with small, measured steps. The applause grew louder as he accepted the plaque, his fingers trembling as they closed around the cool metal. He turned toward the crowd, his cheeks flushed, and managed a small smile before hurrying back to his seat. "You did it," Helen whispered, pulling him into a quick hug. After the ceremony, a tall woman with sleek black hair and a confident smile approached their group. "Elijah, I'm Diana Martinez," she said, extending a hand. "I own a gallery downtown. Your painting moved me deeply. I'd love to feature it in an upcoming youth exhibit. Elijah stared at her, unsure how to respond. He looked to Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "That sounds good," Elijah said quietly. Diana smiled warmly. "Wonderful. We'll be in touch to arrange everything." On the drive home, Elijah sat in the passenger seat, clutching the award plaque tightly. His face was thoughtful, almost contemplative. "You okay?" Helen asked, glancing at him. He nodded slowly. "I think my mom would be proud." Helen's throat tightened at the quiet, heartfelt statement. "She would be," she said softly. "And so am I." For the first time, Elijah's smile wasn't hesitant or shy. It was full of quiet pride. The weeks leading up to the gallery exhibit were a flurry of activity. Elijah's painting was carefully framed, his artist's statement written and rewritten with Helen's help. He was nervous but also excited, his confidence growing with each passing day. At school, Mr. Lopez organized a small celebration, hanging my journey in the classroom, alongside messages of encouragement from Elijah's classmates. Even students who had once mocked him came forward to praise his work, their admiration genuine. "You've inspired a lot of people," Mr. Lopez told him one afternoon. Elijah nodded, his face thoughtful. "It feels good, like I'm finally doing something that matters." The night of the gallery opening, the air buzzed with anticipation. Helen and Sarah stood by Elijah's side as they entered the brightly lit space. Walls were lined with artwork from talented young artists, but my journey commanded immediate attention. The painting's raw emotion and intricate detail drew a crowd, including local journalists and art critics. Elijah stood quietly as Diana introduced him to several prominent figures, each offering praise for his work. When a journalist asked about the inspiration behind its piece, Elijah hesitated, then said, "It's about finding hope when things seem impossible. It's about not giving up." The room fell silent for a moment, his words resonating deeply. Then, the applause began. Soft at first, but soon growing into a thunderous ovation. As the evening wound down, Helen found Elijah sitting on a bench near the gallery's back wall, watching as people admired his work. "You did something amazing tonight," she said, sitting beside him. Elijah nodded, his gaze still fixed on the crowd. "It doesn't feel real yet," he admitted. "It's real," Helen said firmly. "And it's just the beginning." For the first time, Elijah allowed himself to believe her. The success of Elijah's gallery exhibit marked a pivotal moment, not only for the boy, but for Helen and Sarah as well. For the first time, Elijah's story was in the public eye, sparking conversations about systemic issues within the foster care system. Helen and Sarah, inspired by the attention Elijah's journey had garnered, decided it was time to act. One quiet evening, Helen and Sarah sat at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of papers and reports. The room was dimly lit, save for the soft glow of a desk lamp. Elijah was nearby, sketching quietly at the living room table, the sound of his pencil scratching against paper, a soothing backdrop. "We have to do something, Mom," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Elijah's story isn't unique. There are thousands of kids just like him, slipping through the cracks." Helen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But where do we start? The system is so broken, and the problems feel overwhelming." Sarah pushed a report across the table. "We start here. We bring Elijah's story to the forefront and use it to push for tangible reforms. Training programs for caseworkers, increased funding for transitional care centers like New Horizons, and accountability measures for foster families." Helen leaned back in her chair, considering the enormity of the task. But as she glanced at Elijah, engrossed in his art, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's do it," she said finally, her voice steady. Helen and Sarah began by reaching out to their networks. Helen contacted judges, attorneys, and city officials she'd worked with over the years, while Sarah mobilized social workers and nonprofit leaders. Together, they organized a town hall meeting, inviting community members, educators, and foster families to share their experiences and ideas. The meeting took place in a local high school auditorium, which quickly filled with attendees. Helen stood at the podium, her nerves hidden behind years of courtroom composure. "Good evening," she began, her voice echoing through the room. "Tonight, we gather to discuss a crisis that affects the most vulnerable among us, our children. I want to share the story of a young boy named Elijah Brooks." Helen recounted Elijah's journey, from being found outside a diner to the emotional breakthroughs that led to his gallery exhibit. The audience listened intently, many wiping away tears, as she described the systemic failures that had left him alone and vulnerable. Sarah took the stage next, her passion evident as she outlined specific reforms. "We need better oversight, reduced caseloads for social workers, and more resources for foster families," she said, her voice unwavering. "Every child deserves to feel safe, supported, and loved." The town hall sparked a wave of community action. Local businesses pledged donations to transitional care centers, while educators volunteered to mentor foster children. A retired lawyer offered pro bono services to families navigating the adoption process. Elijah, though hesitant, also played a role. He began mentoring younger children at New Horizons, teaching them how to draw and encouraging them to express their emotions through art. His quiet resilience and burgeoning confidence inspired those around him, including the adults. One afternoon, Elijah sat with a small group of children in the center's art room. A shy boy named Liam hesitated over his blank sheet of paper. "I don't know what to draw," he mumbled. "Start with how you feel," Elijah suggested, his tone gentle. "Sometimes it's easier to draw your emotions than to talk about them." Liam looked up at Elijah, his eyes wide with admiration. Slowly, he picked up a crayon and began to draw. As Helen and Sarah's advocacy gained momentum, they encountered resistance. Bureaucratic red tape, budget constraints, and political pushback threatened to derail their efforts. At times, the frustration was palpable. During a meeting with city council members, Helen's patience was tested when one official dismissed their proposals as too ambitious. Helen, normally composed, leaned forward, her voice firm. "Too ambitious? Tell that to the children who go to bed hungry and scared every night. We owe them better." The official shifted uncomfortably, but didn't argue further. At home, Elijah noticed Helen's exhaustion. One evening, he quietly approached her with a drawing. It depicted a strong, towering tree, weathering a fierce storm. "This is you," he said simply, placing the picture in her hands. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Elijah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Despite the challenges, there were small victories. New Horizons received a grant to expand its art therapy program, thanks to Sarah's tireless fundraising efforts. A local news outlet ran a feature on Elijah's gallery exhibit, drawing attention to the broader issues within the foster care system. However, not all news was good. One evening, Helen received a call from Lisa, the director of New Horizons. "We're at capacity again," Lisa said, her voice heavy with worry. "We need more funding, more staff, more everything." Helen sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We'll figure something out, Lisa. We always do." But the strain was evident. Elijah, ever perceptive, noticed the tension and began to withdraw slightly, fearing he might be a burden. Helen and Sarah worked hard to reassure him emphasizing that their fight was for all children, not just him. Elijah continued to grow, both emotionally and artistically. His confidence blossomed as he saw the impact of his story on others. He began to smile more often, his laughter a welcome sound in the once quiet home. One evening, as Helen tucked him in, Elijah looked up at her and said, "Do you think I could really make a difference someday?" Helen's heart swelled with pride. "You already have, Elijah, and I know you'll keep doing amazing things." The chapter ended on a high note, as Helen officially filed for Elijah's adoption. The process was daunting, filled with paperwork and legal hurdles, but Helen approached it with the same determination she brought to her advocacy work. When she told Elijah about her decision, his reaction was quiet but profound. "You mean I'd really be your son?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen knelt in front of him, looking him directly in the eyes. "You already are," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. As they sat together, the weight of the past seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. The day of Elijah's gallery exhibit arrived with a crisp morning breeze, carrying the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. Helen and Elijah stood together in front of the local art gallery, the building's glass facade reflecting the warm sunlight. Inside, a mix of excitement and nervous energy filled the air as final preparations were made. Elijah's pieces had been carefully arranged, each one capturing a fragment of his journey, his loneliness, his resilience, and his growing hope. Guests began to arrive, their voices a gentle hum of conversation. Among them were community leaders, teachers, and families from New Horizons. Sarah arrived with a bouquet of daisies, a proud smile lighting up her face. Elijah stood by his artwork, fidgeting slightly, but maintaining his composure, as guests admired his work. "This is extraordinary," said Diana Martinez, the gallery owner, as she stood beside Helen. "Elijah has a gift. His work speaks to people on a deeply emotional level." Helen's chest swelled with pride. "He's been through so much, but he's channeling it into something beautiful. I think this is just the beginning for him." As the exhibit progressed, Elijah began to relax. Encouraged by Sarah and Helen, he answered questions about his pieces, his voice gaining confidence with each response. One painting, titled "The Bridge," drew particular attention. It depicted a fragile rope bridge spanning a deep canyon, a small figure cautiously stepping forward. "Is this about trust?" a woman asked, her voice soft with admiration. Elijah nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "It's about learning to trust again, even when it's scary." Helen watched the exchange from across the room, her heart full. Elijah's courage in sharing his story and his art was inspiring others, sparking conversations about resilience and the importance of supporting vulnerable children. Toward the end of the evening, Diana Martinez took the stage, her voice commanding yet warm. "Tonight, we've witnessed something remarkable. The power of art to heal and inspire. Elijah Brooks, your work is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for sharing it with us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and shyness. Helen and Sarah clapped the loudest, their smiles wide. The exhibit's success became a catalyst for healing, not just for Elijah, but also for Helen and Sarah. Late one evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Sarah turned to her mother. "You know, Mom," she began hesitantly, "seeing you fight for Elijah, it's made me realize how much you've changed." Helen paused, the dishcloth in her hands forgotten. "I've had to, Sarah. Meeting Elijah forced me to confront my own shortcomings." Sarah nodded, her expression contemplative. "I used to resent how much time you spent at work, But now I see that same dedication helping someone who really needs it. It's inspiring. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry for all the times I wasn't there for you. I can't change the past, but I want to do better for you and for Elijah. Sarah stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. You already are. The moment was brief but significant, a step toward rebuilding the bond they had lost. With the gallery exhibit behind them, Helen and Sarah turned their focus back to systemic reform. Helen filed formal proposals with local and state officials advocating for increased funding for transitional care centers and stricter oversight of foster placements. Sarah spearheaded workshops for social workers, teaching them how to identify signs of trauma and provide better support for children like Elijah. Despite their efforts, challenges persisted. Budget constraints and bureaucratic resistance slowed progress, leaving Helen and Sarah frustrated but undeterred. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, Helen vented her frustration to Sarah over a cup of tea. It feels like we're pushing a boulder uphill, Helen admitted, her voice weary. Sarah nodded, her expression equally fatigued. Change takes time, Mom. But every step forward matters, no matter how small. Their conversation was interrupted by Elijah, who entered the kitchen holding a drawing. I made this for you, he said, handing it to Helen. The drawing depicted two figures climbing a steep hill together, their hands intertwined for support. Helen's throat tightened as she studied the image. Thank you, Elijah. This means so much. As Elijah settled into his new life, his confidence continued to grow. He began participating in school activities, joining the art club, and making new friends. His teachers noticed a change in him, praising his improved focus and willingness to engage. One afternoon, Elijah came home from school beaming. Mr. Lopez asked me to help with the art club's mural project, he announced, his excitement contagious. That's wonderful, Elijah, Helen exclaimed. What will the mural be about? It's about community, Elijah explained. Everyone's drawing something that represents what home means to them. Helen's heart swelled with pride. You're going to do an amazing job. The adoption process moved forward, albeit slowly. Helen spent countless hours gathering the necessary documents, meeting with social workers, and attending court hearings. Each step brought a mix of anticipation and anxiety, but Helen remained steadfast. One morning, as they prepared for yet another meeting, Helen knelt in front of Elijah. This is an important day, she said gently. We're one step closer to making this official. Elijah's expression was a mix of hope and uncertainty. Do you think they'll say yes? Helen placed her hands on his shoulders, her gaze steady. I do, this and no matter what. We're in this together. Amid the challenges, there were moments of joy that reminded Helen why she had taken this journey. Movie nights on the couch, impromptu art sessions at the kitchen table, and quiet evenings reading together became cherished routines. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, Elijah surprised Helen with a question. Do you think my mom would be proud of me? Helen's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. I know she would, she said softly. And I'm proud of you too. Elijah smiled, his expression peaceful. Thanks, Helen, for everything. The day the adoption was finalized was marked by a mix of relief and celebration. In a small courtroom filled with friends and supporters, the judge officially declared Helen as Elijah's legal guardian. Tears streamed down Helen's face as she embraced Elijah, who clung to her tightly. You're stuck with me now, Helen teased, her voice thick with emotion. Elijah grinned. Good. I wouldn't want it any other way. That evening, they celebrated at home with Sarah, sharing stories and laughter over a homemade dinner. For the first time in years, Helen felt a sense of completeness, knowing their family was finally whole. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the community center auditorium, casting a golden glow on the polished wooden stage. The room was filled to capacity, bustling with teachers, social workers, foster parents, and community leaders eager to hear Helen Carpenter speak. Her journey with Elijah had become a beacon of hope, sparking conversations about reform and the importance of action. Standing at the podium, Helen adjusted the microphone, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She scanned the audience, her eyes briefly meeting Elijah's. He sat in the front row, his sketchpad resting on his lap, Sarah beside him for support. "Good morning, everyone," Helen began, her voice clear and confident. "A year ago, I met a boy who had fallen through every crack in our system. He was hungry, scared, and alone. That boy, Elijah, changed my life." The room fell silent as Helen recounted her journey, finding Elijah outside the diner, uncovering the flaws in the foster care system, and her battle to provide him with a stable home. Her words were laced with emotion, her tone both commanding and vulnerable. "Our system is not broken because of a lack of care, but because of a lack of resources and coordination," Helen continued. "Every child deserves a home, a chance to thrive. Elijah's story is a testament to what happens when we refuse to give up." Applause erupted as she concluded, her final words resonating deeply. "Let's not wait for another Elijah to remind us of our duty. Let's act now." As the applause subsided, Helen introduced Elijah, her voice tinged with pride. "Now, I'd like to invite someone very special to the stage. Elijah Brooks has a few words to share." Elijah's heart pounded as he stood, clutching a small piece of paper with trembling hands. Sarah gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and Helen smiled encouragingly as he approached the podium. The crowd's supportive murmurs bolstered his courage. Taking a deep breath, Elijah began, his voice soft but steady. "Before I met Helen, I thought no one cared about kids like me. I was scared and alone, but she showed me that it's okay to trust again." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. "I want to say thank you to everyone who helped me, and I hope we can help more kids like me, because everyone deserves a family." Tears glistened in many eyes as the audience gave him a standing ovation. Elijah stepped back, his face a mix of relief and pride. Helen embraced him as he left the stage, whispering, "You were amazing." The event concluded with a reception, where Elijah's artwork was prominently displayed. His most recent piece, a family tree, garnered significant attention. It depicted a large, sprawling tree, with deep roots and branches filled with colorful leaves, each representing a person who had supported him on his journey. Guests admired the piece, praising its emotional depth and intricate detail. "This tree tells your story beautifully," said a local council member. Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Later, Helen and Sarah joined Elijah near her display. "You've come so far," Sarah said, her voice warm with admiration. "I hope you know how proud we are." Elijah nodded, his confidence growing with each passing moment. "Thanks, Sarah, for everything." That evening, the family returned home, the warmth of the day still lingering in their hearts. Helen prepared Elijah's favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs, while Sarah set the table. Laughter filled the air as they recounted moments from the event, their bond stronger than ever. After dinner, Elijah brought out his sketch pad and began working on a new piece. Helen watched from the couch, a soft smile on her face. "What are you drawing now?" she asked. Elijah looked up, his eyes bright. "You'll see. The next morning, Helen awoke to find a new drawing on the dining table. It was a family portrait, skillfully capturing the three of them, Helen, Sarah, and Elijah, standing together in front of their home. The expressions on their faces radiated happiness and contentment, and the details were strikingly precise. Helen's heart swelled as she studied the piece, her eyes lingering on the words Elijah had written at the bottom, "My forever family." When Elijah came downstairs, she pulled him into a tight hug. "This is beautiful, Elijah. Thank you." Elijah smiled, his confidence shining through. "I wanted to show how I feel now. Safe, happy, home." In the weeks that followed, Helen and Sarah worked tirelessly to build on the momentum from the community event. They organized workshops for foster parents, hosted fundraisers for New Horizons, and met with policymakers to advocate for systemic reforms. Elijah, too, found his role in the movement. He began mentoring younger children at the care center, using art to help them express their feelings. His quiet leadership and empathy earned him admiration from both peers and adults. One afternoon, while helping a boy with his drawing, Elijah said, "You don't have to be perfect, just try. That's what matters." The boy nodded, inspired by Elijah's words. Helen watched from the doorway, her heart full of pride. The adoption officially finalized. Helen, Sarah, and Elijah settled into their new life together. Their days were filled with small joys, movie nights, art projects, and shared meals. Elijah's laughter echoed through the house, a sound that had once been so rare. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elijah turned to Helen. "Do you think I can be an artist when I grow up?" Helen smiled, her voice unwavering. "I don't think it. I know it. You can be anything you want, Elijah." The chapter ends with a letter from Helen, written for a local newsletter. In it, she shares their story, urging readers to consider fostering, adopting, or supporting organizations like New Horizons. "Every child deserves a chance," she writes. Elijah's story is proof that when we open our hearts, we can change lives, not just theirs, but our own. As the letter reaches readers across the community, it inspires a wave of support, proving that Elijah's journey has touched far more lives than he ever imagined. In the final scene, Elijah places his family portrait on the mantel above the fireplace. He steps back, studying it with a satisfied smile. Helen and Sarah join him, their arms around his shoulders. "This feels like a new beginning," Sarah says softly. "It is," Helen agrees. "For all of us." As the camera pans out, the warmth of their home contrasts with the night sky, a beacon of hope and love shining through the darkness. As the screen fades to black, a soft piano melody plays in the background, setting a reflective tone. The final words appear, narrated with warmth and sincerity. What would you do if you met someone like Elijah? His story reminds us of the power of compassion and the strength it takes to rebuild a life from broken pieces. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of Elijah's journey touched your heart the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us as we uncover more powerful, real-life tales of resilience, love, and hope. Together, we can inspire change, one story at a time. See you in the next chapter. The words linger on the screen, inviting the audience to act while the music gently fades out.